Imagine a stark reality where a simple piece of yellow metal decides the fate of millions and topples mighty empires. Although Britain commanded the oceans at the turn of the century, its national treasury was dangerously close to running completely empty. Understanding the bloodshed in the Boer trenches requires a deep look inside the secretive vaults of the Bank of England. In 1899, the gold standard reigned supreme, meaning every paper banknote was merely a promise for physical metal. Every British pound circulating from London to Bombay required the backing of solid gold bullion stored securely in a vault. If the nation's gold reserves diminished, Britain's ability to deploy naval fleets and conquer new territories would instantly vanish. Beneath the surface of Victorian prosperity, a dangerous financial crisis was brewing that threatened to destroy the entire imperial empire. As factories worldwide expanded production, global trade demanded far more currency than existing gold reserves could possibly support. Due to the scarcity of precious metal, prices collapsed, and suffocating debt gripped everyone from wealthy industrial tycoons to poor farmers. Financiers in the City of London panicked over a severe liquidity crisis that seemed poised to crash the global market. The empire desperately needed a massive influx of new gold immediately, or the pound would surrender its dominance to rivals. Emerging powers like Germany and the United States were aggressively hoarding bullion and challenging Britain for the crown of global trade. Elite British strategists understood that controlling the world's gold supply meant dictating political rules for the next century. Just as the system neared total collapse, a geological miracle appeared in the dusty landscape of the South African Transvaal. In 1886, weary prospectors discovered the Witwatersrand, a geological formation containing the largest gold deposit in history. The lifeline for the British Empire lay waiting, but it was located within the territory of a stubborn independent republic. This staggering geological discovery held enough buried wealth to secure the stability of the British currency for generations to come. The major problem was that Queen Victoria did not control the land. A group of independent settlers held the keys. These pious farmers were deeply religious men who held absolutely no patience for modern corporate greed or British imperial arrogance. Conditions were perfectly set for a catastrophic collision between two opposing worlds battling for control of the global economy. To these pious locals, the sudden flood of fortune hunters felt like a biblical plague sent to rot their traditional soul. They dubbed them Uitlanders, outsiders who flooded in until they actually outnumbered the Boer voters in the mining districts. Pulling the strings of this chaotic mess were the Randlords, mining sharks running the show from boardrooms in London. Powerful men like Cecil Rhodes didn't see a sovereign nation. They saw a branch office that needed better management. But the geology played a cruel joke, forcing these tycoons to chase total political dominance over the region. This wasn't a California gold rush with easy nuggets. The gold was microscopic dust locked inside rock hard as hell. Getting it out cost a fortune in heavy gear and chemicals funded by European investors biting their nails. Since the gold count was pitifully low, profit margins were razor thin, and one wrong move meant bankruptcy. A single penny hike in taxes or supplies could turn a functioning gold mine into a money pit overnight. Enter President Paul Kruger, the massive thorn in the side of every financial accountant in London. His regime slapped a state monopoly on dynamite, crucial for blasting rock, and charged whatever price they felt like. They jacked up rates to funnel millions from private mines straight into the Boer government's personal pockets. They also rigged the train fares, forcing gold shipments onto slow, overpriced routes that suited their politics. The magnates ran the numbers and realized the Boer government was a line item they couldn't afford. Word spread through London that if you wanted real returns, the regime in Pretoria had to go. The theory was simple. A British flag means no monopolies, lower taxes, and a steady stream of cheap labor. Meanwhile, Kruger was taking that tax revenue and buying Mauser rifles and German artillery by the boatload. The British were tearing their hair out, knowing their own investments were paying for the enemy's war machine. The nightmare scenario was a wealthy armed Boer state teaming up with Germany to turn off the gold tap. And that is how the war started. Not over national honor, but because the financial ledger didn't balance. In October 1899, the political dam finally broke, sending tremors through global markets that threatened financial stability. As war drums began beating, vital gold shipments to London ceased, immediately acting like a tourniquet on the economy. Panic swept through the London exchange as mining stocks plummeted, instantly wiping out massive fortunes built over decades. The Bank of England desperately hiked interest rates to 6% to prevent cash from fleeing the country in terror. Officials sold investors a comforting fantasy that the conflict would be a simple military cakewalk finished by Christmas. Instead of waiting, the Boers launched a brutal offensive, encircling strongholds and dragging the British army through the mud. Defying expectations, the Boers captured the mines intact and used the gold to directly bankroll their war effort. Ironically, the very gold intended to support the British pound was now purchasing munitions used to kill English soldiers. British taxpayers suddenly realized this was not a cheap skirmish, but a bottomless money pit draining the national wealth. London had absolutely no choice but to ship immense tonnage of supplies and legions of men halfway across the globe. Every bullet fired and ration consumed bled an imperial treasury that was already gasping for financial air. Then came Black Week in December, where 3 crushing military defeats shook the empire's arrogance to its very core. Panic tore through London offices as the unthinkable loomed. Losing this war meant losing total control of the gold. A defeat would trigger the collapse of the gold standard and strip London of its title as the financial hub. Facing disaster, the empire resolved to throw infinite resources at the problem regardless of the staggering financial cost. They mobilized reservists and rallied colonies, turning the entire industrial machine toward the single goal of obliterating Boer resistance. Never before had a modern superpower warped its entire economy so drastically just to secure a monopoly on one commodity. The Randlords applied suffocating political pressure, ensuring the government wouldn't retreat despite the rapidly mounting body count. They knew if the Union Jack didn't fly over Pretoria, their stock portfolios would be completely worthless paper. The conflict ceased being a territorial dispute and morphed into a hostile corporate takeover executed with heavy artillery. By the year 1900, the sheer crushing weight of British military numbers began suffocating the enemy forces. Lord Roberts seized the capital and, most importantly, placed the Witwatersrand goldfields under tight imperial security. City tycoons, celebrated with champagne, convinced the profitable dividends would immediately start flowing into their accounts again. However, the Boers refused to surrender, scattering into mobile commando units to wage a bitter guerrilla war. They destroyed railway tracks and supply lines, creating a hellscape where operating a mine became physically impossible. The cost of war skyrocketed past £200 million, a sum threatening to completely bankrupt the British exchequer. To plug this gaping financial hole, the government was forced to issue massive amounts of public debt called consols. The irony was thick. The war started for gold was now draining the Bank of England's vaults at dizzying speed. Ordinary citizens asked why their taxes were skyrocketing just to bail out a private commercial mining venture. To finally crush the guerrillas, high command resorted to the brutal, scorched earth strategy, targeting survival itself. The ruthless logic was simple: if the rebels fed off their farms, those farms must be wiped off the map. Troops ravaged the countryside, torching over 30,000 homesteads and slaughtering millions of livestock to deny food. This was total economic warfare designed to destroy the enemy's assets and starve them into total submission. Homeless women and children were herded like cattle into hastily constructed and overcrowded concentration camps. These were not just prisons. They were calculated instruments designed to psychologically break the men fighting in the bush. Between starvation and rampant disease, over 26,000 Boer civilians and countless African natives perished miserably. This horror was the result of cold accounting. It was cheaper to let civilians die than prolong the war. Back in London, the Liberal opposition raged against these methods of barbarism used to secure the bullion. But cash remained king. The mines had to operate, and peace was a non-negotiable prerequisite for profit. The frigid logic of financial balance sheets justified one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the new century. In May 1902, starving Boer commandos finally laid down their arms, broken by the tragic deaths of their families. The Treaty of Vereeniging officially ended the Republic's independence and placed the gold firmly into British hands forever. The Empire claimed victory, but it was a Pyrrhic triumph that left the South African economy in absolute smoking ruins. Mining magnates rushed back to Johannesburg, desperate to fire up the pumps and send miners back underground immediately. However, they ran headfirst into a catastrophic labor crisis that nobody in the financial city had seen coming. During the chaos of war, African laborers had dispersed, returning to their villages to farm their own land in peace. After seeing wages plummet and conditions deteriorate, they flatly refused to return to the misery and danger of the shafts. The entire Witwatersrand economic scheme relied heavily on an endless stream of cheap, easily exploitable human bodies. Without low-cost labor processing, the low-grade ore became prohibitively expensive and the mining math stopped making sense. The owners tried to slash wages even further, but the move backfired spectacularly, making the manpower shortage even worse. The gears of industry ground to a halt, and London's financial heart skipped beats as investors demanded blood for the delay. Lord Milner knew the score: get the gold flowing again, or watch Britain's newest prize collapse into history's dustbin. Desperate times called for a specific kind of worker, silent, obedient, and utterly stripped of the right to organize. Driven by cold, hard greed, they cooked up a ruthless solution: import cheap muscle all the way from China. The plan was simple math: pack thousands of indentured laborers onto ships and slash operating costs to the absolute bone. Human beings were reduced to mere fuel, just disposable cogs, in a machine built to strip the earth bare. Recruiters in Beijing peddled lies in fine print promising a golden future that was nothing but smoke and mirrors. The public cried foul, but let's be honest, profit margins always shout much louder than moral objections. The mining beast was hungry, and since the locals wouldn't feed it, the empire looked east to harvest sweat. Ships weighed anchor their holds, packed tight with the human fuel required to jumpstart the empire's stalled financial engine. Between 1904 and 1910, over 63,000 laborers were shipped directly into the Witwatersrand's hungry maw. Confined within fenced compounds and isolated from society, their existence shrank to the single brutal task of swinging a pickaxe. The ruthless gamble paid off spectacularly. With the new workforce overhead, costs plummeted while production figures skyrocketed. While efficient, their true value to the Randlords lay in their enforced silence and complete lack of political power. With the critical labor bottleneck finally smashed, gold output from the Rand doubled, almost in the blink of an eye. The Bank of England's vaults groaned under the weight of fresh bullion, giving the pound sterling a spine of solid gold. City brokers finally exhaled in relief as liquid capital flooded back into global financial veins, stabilizing the system. Back in London, however, the scandal dubbed Chinese slavery detonated in Parliament like a political grenade. The severe backlash toppled the Conservative government, proving that dirty money sometimes comes with a heavy political price tag, yet the economic mission was accomplished. The mines were successfully rescued, and dividends flowed like water again. They slowly shipped the workers back home, leaving behind a local labor market that was completely and irrevocably shattered. Squeezed by aggressive taxes and stripped of their land, locals had no choice but to accept whatever starvation wages were offered. This laid the bedrock for the exploitative migrant labor system that defined South African society for the next century. London had successfully spun a complex web designed for one purpose, feeding the insatiable hunger of foreign investors. With the cash cow secure, the Crown turned its gaze toward managing the difficult politics of the conquered territory. Defying expectations, they extended an olive branch to their old Afrikaner enemies, desperate for long-term stability. The deal was the Union of South Africa, handing the defeated Afrikaners a serious chunk of legislative control. The price of admission was simple. London maintained its iron grip on the gold mines and crucial shipping lanes. The nation's fate was signed in blood and ink, a pragmatic handshake between the rebels' rifle and the banker's ledger. Of course, the black population footed the bill, cast aside politically to keep this new white coalition happy. In 1910, the Union of South Africa rose as an imperial fortress built upon a foundation of solid gold. The war had been a massive gamble, but it paid out. Britain now controlled the planet's largest gold reserve. This logistical victory arrived at the perfect moment, just as the ominous drums of war began beating across Europe. South African gold became the vital financial oxygen that allowed Britain to construct its massive war machine against Germany. While the German Kaiser scrambled desperately for scraps, the British Empire sat comfortably on an endless supply of cash. Mining companies like Consolidated Gold Fields evolved into corporate leviathans, wielding frightening levels of political power. New technologies developed to rip gold from the deep earth completely revolutionized the global mining industry forever. Yet the deep scars of the war refused to heal, branded permanently into the collective Afrikaner soul. Bitter memories of concentration camps fed a toxic nationalism that would eventually rot and bloom into apartheid. On the global stage, this gold rush kept the dying gold standard on life support for another 20 years. It created a dangerous illusion of stability, merely papering over the massive structural cracks in the global economy. Everyone swallowed the lie that as long as the gold kept coming, the economic party would never end. This belief fueled the first great wave of globalization, linking markets from Shanghai all the way to New York. Few people in Europe realized their bank accounts were effectively propped up by deep-level mining in Africa. The stable price of their daily bread was paid for by men sweating their lives away 3 kilometers underground. The conflict taught a harsh lesson in the age of heavy industry. Bankers, not generals, call the shots. This was not a crusade for honor or faith, but a bare-knuckle brawl to seize control of the economy. Dragging South Africa onto the world stage was forced integration paid for in blood smoke and steel. It proved that the market's so-called invisible hand is perfectly happy to wear a brass knuckle when necessary. With 1914 looming, that blood-soaked bullion was stockpiled and ready to bankroll the coming Great War. The moment the First World War ignited, South African gold bars transformed into essential rocket fuel for the Allied war machine. London shipped boatloads of bullion across the Atlantic, physically moving millions into American vaults to keep ammunition flowing. Without that massive purchasing power, the British military engine would have sputtered and died long before 1916 arrived. Crushing the Boer republics turned out to be the financial life raft that kept the British Empire afloat in darkness. However, this saga of gold dust and gunpowder didn't simply end when the peace treaties were signed in Europe. The South African playbook of fighting wars for resources became the standard operating procedure for the entire 20th century. It marked a massive pivot where nations stopped painting maps red and started obsessing over securing raw material supply lines. The Boer War shouted the quiet part out loud. Modern economies are insatiable beasts that constantly need to be fed. It revealed a terrifying truth, that the line between a massive corporation and a national government is sometimes paper thin. Those Randlords were effectively the founding fathers of the mega corporations that pull the strings of international politics today. And the gold itself still sits there gathering dust in deep central bank vaults, a silent witness to history. There is a solid chance the gold in your wedding band or smartphone came from the mines that sparked that slaughter. That metal carries the heavy, invisible spiritual weight of every life extinguished on the altar of profit. Today, the tunnels of the Witwatersrand hold the depth record, plunging 4 kilometers down into the Earth's crust. They stand as a brutal monument to human engineering, but also to our bottomless greed and the cost of war. When you look back at this era, do not get distracted by the khaki uniforms and the antique rifles. Focus instead on the ledgers, the stock certificates, and that unquenchable thirst for the yellow metal. They say history is written by the victors, but the real economic story is hidden deep in the accounting books. The Boer conflict was arguably the first true capitalist war, turning the battlefield into a branch office of the stock market. On that trading floor, the currency was human blood, and the jackpot was nothing less than global domination. Next time chaos erupts in a resource-rich nation, pause and remember the harsh lessons learned in the Transvaal. Ask yourself, who is cashing the checks? Funding the violence, and what specific treasure lies buried beneath the soil? This story is a grim warning that when profit margins are threatened, morality is always the very first casualty. We must remember that the global economy is not a friendly handshake, but a ruthless and calculating power structure. The gold standard is history, but the desperate hunger to control resources is as fierce today as back then. Ghosts of the Rand magnates still haunt power corridors, whispering that the bottom line justifies absolutely any action taken. Yet we must not forget the grit of those who stood their ground to block the imperial steamroller's path. From Boer commandos to migrant laborers, their lived experiences are the threads that weave this complex tapestry together. Understanding this war completely changes how you view that shiny yellow metal humanity has been obsessed with for centuries. It is not just a status symbol, it is a trigger exposing the best and absolute worst of human nature. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the financial guts and hidden motives of the Boer War. We have blown the dust off history books to reveal the cold metal beating at the heart of conflict. If this sparked your interest, consider how many other wars in history started for the exact same financial reasons. Whether for oil territory or trade routes, this economic blueprint for conflict gets reused over and over again. History is a messy web, but economics is usually the invisible string keeping the whole thing from unraveling completely. Please like and subscribe so we can continue digging into the world's dirty financial secrets and history together. We will keep tracking how cold, hard cash has carved out the destiny of entire nations and empires throughout time. Until next time, keep looking for the truth buried deep behind the sensational headlines and the corporate balance sheets. Signing off from the ghosts of the old gold fields, I will catch you in the next episode. The wind blows silently over the abandoned mine dumps of the Witwatersrand, keeping its secrets for eternity.